Hi, I'm Phil Harbottle, and this is my third video talking about 1950s British science fiction paperbacks, or rather the genesis of them, where they came from and what happened to them. Now, in the course of my investigations, I soon discovered that they disappeared from the current bookstores. This was late 1954 when I first found them in the second-hand shop in Wallsend. And when I looked for them on the current bookstores, to my surprise, they'd all virtually disappeared. Now, the reason for this was because of the Second World War. During the Second World War, there was all kinds of austerity, and the booklets that they produced were very cheaply produced basic books. April 1940 was the date when paper rationing came in all across Britain, and the fiction publishing industry was thrown into chaos. Previously, the publishers had issued thousands of hardcover books, but suddenly, with paper restricted, and especially the boards used for the hardcovers, they were struggling. Now, with the war economy standards limiting the number of new hardcover books, a new breed of publishers emerged. They scented a golden opportunity. Anything new on the market was assured of a ready sale. New publishing companies, as John Russell Fearn observed in a letter to his friend and fellow writer Norman Lazenby, were springing up like mushrooms. These mushroom publishers were usually small operations, with one person acting as editor and another handling the business of putting the product on the market. The cheapest printing methods were used, and no effort was used to turn out a quality product. Sometimes the paper used was so bad that there was a distinct see-through from the print on the other side. Sometimes the paper used changed from white to green or pink. The supplies of each 16-page signature, 8 pages folded in half, ran out. The resultant thin booklets were usually not worth the effort of reading. At the height of this shortage, any kind of paper was used, and some products looked as if they'd been printed on toilet paper, which was appropriate in some cases, but that didn't concern the publishers unduly. Their booklets would still sell. One of the main publishers of these cheap booklets was Gerald G. Swann. Here, for example, is what I was talking about. This book here, Terror Strikes, 1946. You see the height of the paper shortage, the shocking paper. It's like toilet paper. You can see through it. And of course, to reduce the number of pages, they had to use tiny type. So, unfortunately, this book, which is actually a very good book, has sort of gone down and, passed into obscurity because of the awkward format. Here you see the staples beginning to rust. It is 1946 after all, very old. And you can see on the other books, they were all done in the same cheap printed format with staples. All 16-page signatures. So if you had 16 pages, it was 8 pages folded, and then you add the covers, and it come out as a 32-page book. Now here is an example of some of the dreadful paper they had to use. I mean, look at that. And of course, and with the tiny, cheap type, even the best story would, it would just, I don't know. I couldn't read it. If I was presented with that on the bookstall now, I wouldn't pick it up. But never mind. And here's another example of the cheap printing. You see here, the blue and the red are not synchronized. It's completely off. Now that should have been, that print run should have been rejected and reprinted. But maybe somebody thought it looked a bit weird, like a 3D effect. but it's not intentional. That is a mistake. Now, occasionally, a printer would, or a publisher would use full colour, say the higher price, 9pence, rather than 6pence. Now these, they were novellas. They ran to usually to 64 pages, about 30,000 words, and they were side stitched. So, but occasionally, sometimes the books were printed too close to the margin, and they were very cheaply printed. But that's one of the better ones. It's actually a very good book. It's been reprinted in the last few years. Now here's an example of a Gerald G. Swann. There was a whole series of these, thrills, murder, vengeance, crime, all published by Gerald G. Swann. Gerald G. Swann Limited seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of paper of varying grades of quality granted. Foreseeing the likely shortages, Swann had craftily built up stocks of titles and printed the books before issuing them on the market. When the impending war finally came in September 1939, Swann's warehouses were already well stocked with printed material. As other firms struggled or went to the wall as the paper shortages bit, Swann made a killing with a huge diversity of publications, from adult fiction and magazines to children's annuals, which he called albums, all carrying his distinctive Gerald Swann logo. And he also did a lot of comic books. Swann had apparently cut a good deal with American pulp publisher Louis Silvercleat, owner of the Blue Ribbon chain of magazines in America, and he had obtained British reprint rights to a great deal of their pulp fiction. During the war, Swann did have the astuteness to obtain British rights to some 1940 to 41 editions of the famous magazine Weird Tales for the American News Company. However, Swann's three 1942 editions failed to make any real impact because of the very poor, shoddy quality of the paper, the single colour blue covers, and it gave it a Poverty Row appearance. And they were not helped by the use of microscopic typeface. Here you can see the shoddy quality of the paper used. That's a nice white, the heavy quality stock for the cover, but the interior paper was back to the toilet roll standard, and the typeface was microscopic. They're all the same. Good quality stock for the cover, but the paper inside was dreadful. There you see the dreaded staples, which have rusted. So despite the high standard of the contents, we were top American authors, this magazine failed to make any impact, and it soon faded after 3 issues. Some of the earliest Swann science fiction reprinted from America was from the pulp magazine Science Fiction and its companion titles, such as Science Fiction Quarterly and Future Fiction. Swann's Yankee short series was launched in 1941, along with Yankee Romances, Yankee Mystery, and Yankee Science Fiction as the 3rd issue. Swann recycled many stories from the American pulp magazines, and he issued them under various series such as Yankee Science Fiction and Yankee Weird Stories. Some of them were British originals, but most of them were American reprints. Let's see. That's a British original. It wasn't a very good quality, as you can see from that. And that was American reprinted from the Blue Ribbon magazines. Earlier in 1940, Swann had issued an original magazine which he titled Weird Story Magazine. And this was mostly written by one of his staff writers, William Elliot, who wrote a lot for Swann. But it wasn't of a very high quality, and there was only the one issue of it. Though weird stories continued to pop up in assorted Swann publications after that. Now, Swann continued to issue the occasional science fiction reprinted from the Blue Ribbon chain of magazines, such as the series of actual paperbacks, which you can see here. Now, they were actually reprinted from the American magazine Science Fiction Quarterly. That was reprinted from the summer 1940 issue as a paperback anthology. There, incidentally, you can see the full range of all the miscellaneous Swann publications. But this book, although it was entitled The Moon Conquerors, that was just like the lead novel. And then it was filled up with the remaining stories that had been in the original magazine. We'll just see the start of one. There, the lead novel ended, and then it was filled up with the remaining short stories that were in the magazine. So that was actually an edition of Science Fiction Quarterly, American magazine, but issued as a British paperback. And was one of the very earliest to have the word science fiction on the cover. Here we see a second issue of Science Fiction Quarterly, originally in winter 1941-42, with the lead novel by Ray Cummings. The covers of these publications, in common with most of Swann's wartime offerings, were printed in sort of a blue monochrome for cheapness, and the tiny print conserved the number of pages because of the severe paper shortages. Now, perhaps Swann's most curious wartime offering, now a legendary collector's item, was the twopenny shocker called They Came From Mars by Halifax writer W.P. Cockcroft, Wilfred Cockcroft. Its lurid cover drawing by Swann's overworked staff artist Jock McHale showed two aviators being attacked by a giant six-legged rat, whilst the blurb proclaimed it as a tale of thrills and terror on the Red Planet. Now, the juvenile appearance of this was no coincidence, because almost certainly the story had been written by Cockcroft for the boys' magazine Scoops, which had ceased publication in 1934. It was a science fiction, the first British science fiction magazine, but a juvenile one. And Cockcroft had almost certainly written They Came From Mars for Scoops, and he had it lying in his bottom drawer when Swann came calling. Occasionally, one of these British mushroom publishers would commission one of the thriller or western writers to make an attempt at science fiction. And here we see 4 magazines, 2 of each, strange adventures and futuristic stories that were put out by one of Sir Swann's main competitors, Hamilton and Company. But unfortunately, there was a rush assignment for the poor author, who was actually quite a talented writer called Norman Firth, but he was given an impossibly short timetable to write the entire contents of these magazines under various pseudonyms. And they commissioned a cover artist who obviously, as you can see from this, with his dustbin robots and blobby monster, had no idea what science fiction was about, and so it gave them an unfortunately juvenile appearance. It wasn't helped, of course, by printed on shoddy paper with cartoon-like illustrations. And unfortunately, this series with the usual see-through quality paper as well. And this series sort of sank without a trace. Although nowadays, of course, especially in America, this rare, because of its rarity and unusual appearance, they're quite collector's items, but they don't deserve to be because they were very poor quality. And in the late 40s, science fiction never really got off the ground in Britain. Until, that is, with the easing of paper restrictions and the improvement in printing techniques, and in particular the advent of indigenous good science fiction writers such as John Russell Swann and E.C. Tubb, and not least because of the emergence of decent cover artist Ron Turner, things began to take a turn for the better. And this will be the subject of my next video about the emerging of what is more properly science fiction paperbacks. These are more or less pamphlets, but in 1950 there was launched a resurgence in the genre. It was in fact in 1950 that some paper restrictions began to ease and there was improvements in printing technology. So we saw the emergence, or we will in the next video, see the emergence of what we'll say were proper paperbacks, nicely printed, and especially with fine cover artwork by such artists as Ron Turner.